Many political parties exist and many have been created. They all have one thing in common which assures, we will get more of the same, regardless which party is elected. That is not to say one party will not push things one way whereas another will push things in the opposite direction. The right/left divide is all about transforming the state in a limited number of ways. The state is plastic but not structureless. It will retain its identity even as it is modified in the way this identity is expressed. The state has a core element that is never breached or altered. The party that goes too far to the left will lose support in the same way that the party that pushes the social envelope too far right will cause the people to revolt. There is a reason for this. The system is designed with governors, devices that resist radical transformation. So we see extremists on both right and left absorbed and neutered, their momentum broken on the shoals of a system that possesses a short attention span. In short, the political parties are all about modifying the state within a set of predefined limits. Any group that attempts to go beyond the established parameters, lose their momentum as the self-interest of others becomes more aroused. There is only a few in the middle that can be roused to swing this way or that. And the more that swing one way, the more those on the other side are driven to oppose them. But what does each side truly offer? Will more or less unemployment make things that different? Does more or less debt accomplish anything substantial? The remedies of politicians are akin to a doctor trying to cure a patient by reducing symptoms but never eliminating the causative agent. The nation cannot be cured when the pathological agent is never identified and when the only mechanism we have for curing the disease is actually the carrier. In short, the state is the problem. It is not the vehicle for finding a solution. To understand this, better think of the simplest state one can imagine. This proto-state is composed of only two persons. One person produces goods and services, and the other one directs the work and seizes 2/3 of the output. Would changing who works and who administrates the system solve the real problem, which is that one works and the other reaps? If we increased the numbers in the state to 3 and one worked, one administrates and the other plays the victim, would have improved the system? No, it would not. The system is only changed in a fundamental way when those who work reap what they sowed. We can play around with the numbers, but ultimately what we have is portion who produces goods and services and has value, and another portion who do nothing more than drain wealth from those who created it. The state produces nothing, and this is a serious problem. At best it only adds to the problem by patronizing the least active and the ones with the lowest productivity. Do political parties promise to do absolutely nothing for all? That is the best they could do, as this would cost the people who work nothing. But they do not do that because they do not produce anything of value. If they promised to do nothing, they would not get paid, and if they did not get paid, they would have no way to live. So they promise to help those who will not work, while the only thing they can promise the worker is that they will protect them from others who are more avaricious than themselves. Naturally, things did not start out this way. The state had to normalize its existence over time. The state started out as tribal leaders and coordinators. They could wield only as much power as they could pay for. They could fund muscle only to the degree they could control the nation's assets. Power is always exercised over property, and this control of property gives leaders power over people, or at least some degree of influence. In the early days we were hunters, then agriculturalists. Life was simple, and for the most part we each produced what we needed. One thing we did not produce and did not need was the state. But did non-parasites ever want or need the state? Historically the state, in the form of oppressive hierarchies, was forced upon us. At first, the most powerful and least moral took what was produced, in raids that often destroyed the economy. If the rapine got too serious, the peasants and workers fled the area. No doubt many of the abandoned towns were abandoned because of the oppressiveness of those who would rather steal than work. People could not make a living and so fled to more benign jurisdictions. But what happened was that as people became more productive and the seizures more prevalent and profitable, the areas that the Lord could control became larger and escape was no longer a viable option for many. The state was, at the dawn of civilization, not much more than the richest neighbor who was able to organize a local gang of thugs, perhaps made up largely of brothers and sons. Large families composed primarily of males had an advantage over smaller families and those made up largely of females. These male cohorts grew larger over time. At first, they were little more than bands of brigands who raided other tribes as opportunities arose. Over time, as the systems of rapine became more sophisticated and the structure of these units became more organized, the power block took on more of the traits of a state. Eventually, in the West anyway, men learned how to be kings, then emperors. The crucial step was the formation of standing armies. To have a body of men devoted to nothing but war was a huge advantage. But it was always a struggle between the parasitic and the productive. It was a war of two worlds, and two races, though history always records these battles as a struggle between two different power blocks. The true divide is between those who produce and those who primarily consume. Kings fought each other. Empires struggled to absorb more land and more peoples. Recorded history is a narrative of powerful men struggling for the dominant position. The ordinary man is largely forgotten. But it is the farmer and tradesperson who holds the balance of power. The farmer, the laborer, the craftsman serves as a backdrop to historic events. He is mentioned as the person whose fields are destroyed, whose cattle are run off, and whose boys are taken as potential soldiers in future raids. But it is these persons who ultimately fund armies and empires. The iron worker and carpenter is viewed by historians as just an anthill crushed beneath the boots of marching men, bent on conquest. But these are the people who made the nations and fed the armies. Without them the standing army would not exist. However, there is a dynamic not talked about in our history books. The farmer does not need the Lord, but the Lord is totally dependent on the farmer. The farmer does not need to be part of an empire. The draftsman does not need a king. The king creates the need for the king. The king exists to defend his kingdom from those who would be king in his stead. For this, both he and his rivals need the famer and the other productive persons. To operate his armies, the king uses generals, captains, colonels and so on. The king creates ranks to form a hierarchy of power answerable to him. But the army is not an effective tool for taking from the people of what the king wants. For this task bureaucracy was invented. Britain succeeded because it developed the most effective system for creating and distributing wealth. Despite the oppression and exploitation it heaped on its citizens, it is predicted that Britain oppressed and exploited less than its rivals. But the point is, remove the kings and eliminate the kingdoms, and one does not need them. The bureaucratic state generates its own legitimacy, in the same way a protection racket is justified by its own hand. This is where the outlines of the real war start to become visible, the war alluded to in Ephesians 6 verse 12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. We wrestle with the state, or more specifically the regulatory state. We war against it because it is inherently parasitic, and taxpayers are its host. Church and state are incompatible. The church is the alternative state or the alternative to the state. It is foreordained by God to serve his purpose. But then, if this is so, what do Christians make of these verses? Romans 13 verses 1 to 5. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God, the powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same, for he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. In other words, serve the will of the state as the ambassador of God, not just out of fear but because it is the right thing to do. However, it is stated that the power of the state comes from God. This is an interesting passage because it clearly tells us not to use force to defeat force. We are not to resist but be subject to the higher powers. This requirement to be subject to the higher powers applies as much to the ruler as to the citizen. Ultimately, the highest of all powers is God, which lays a responsibility on the ruler to follow God, also. Regardless, when the ruler is not godly and the state is not subject to biblical teachings, there is a higher power to correct them. This is what we are ultimately subject to. This is the spiritual state. The state under the aegis of God wields the greater power. The spiritual state, under God, has greater power and more authority than the terrestrial state, for this has a master that is not God. The rejection of power as a vehicle of change is not a coincidence. The foundation of the bureaucratic state is power. The bureaucratic state is a product of exercised power. It operates according to the law of the jungle, which decrees that might makes right and the end justifies the means. In other words, the only measure of right is a positive result. The right thing to do is to do that which produces the result you want. Success in the naturalist view of things is its own justifier. Christians are or ought to be at war with this version of the state, not from the perspective of a violent overthrow or revolution, though many advocate for this, because the use of violence simply results in the exchange of one political party for another. When one resorts to violence to get what one wants, success is determined by who has the ability to harm the other party the most, while recovering from the harm done it, in the least amount of time. The power of the church is in its productivity. The spiritual state is an organization that pays its own costs. There is no parasitism, and because there is no parasitism we can say that the spiritual state is composed of spiritually mature Christians. The spiritual state is the church and the church is spiritually mature Christians. The spiritual state party's platform is a guarantee to eliminate parasitism, including the parasitic state, and to protect the rights of all persons who create value. The worker is worthy of his wages. We each own without qualification what we produce.